first off, let's talk about what force or what power is. And the basic formula there is force times velocity, right? So it's how fast we're moving something, right? Easy formula to remember, right? So there's a time component there, and that goes into the calculations of how much load should I use at certain components and things like that. So, but you don't have to. So if you just understand basically, it's how fast can we move this weight, right? Or this load or this mass, whatever it happens to be, whether it's your body weight, a barbell, a ball, a sled, whatever the thing is, right? That's really what we're kind of calculating here. And the important thing to understand there is the strength lays the foundation for this. So you have to have a decent amount of strength, and you have to have skill in order to express the strength in the way through that force velocity curve, which we can kind of talk about a little bit, to make it make sense. Otherwise, what are we doing, right? We're just moving things faster. And there's value in moving things faster, but there's some application there that needs to go into it. So I think if we broke it down like into like kind of a framework, the framework would be we're going to be using like moderate loads. And that is relative to what it is that we're lifting and who it is you are as a human and what it is we're trying to train. But the bottom line is these are sub-maximal loads, right? And we'll give you some percentages here in a little bit. The other thing is like maximum intent. This is probably the most important thing. Like that is, what am I trying to do? My brain needs to be locked into this. Like it is very intentional, and it's almost exhausting mentally to do this type of work. And that's going to require a few other things. One is when you're locked in like that, another principle here would be low reps and low sets. So this is not something we're doing a ton of. We're being very intentional with these submaximal loads. And we're in doing so, we're going to be doing low reps and low sets of this stuff, which then pulls into the next piece is making sure you're managing your recovery times in between sets or reps and workout bouts in terms of what we're applying. So another huge component, which I think is often misapplied, go back to the person putting plyometrics at the end of their workout. We'll come back to that. Like, what are you really getting out of that? You're getting some conditioning, but what are you leaving on the table in terms of the power increase component? And then last but not least, when you're doing these movements, form and your mechanics are critical. And that cannot be left out. You do not want to be training power with shitty mechanics. So there's some skills stuff that needs to go into this. And if I had to add another thing there, it would be like a proper warm up to prepare the system for what we're about to do to it. And there's a lot of things that go into that, but that's kind of like the basic framework. So another quick recap is moderate loads, maximum intent, low reps and sets, full recovery, proper form, and make sure you're getting a good warm up in. So an intentional warm up that preps us for the movement that we're about to do. You guys want to add anything to that? Did I hit the basics?
I think it is important to kind of, we talked about how strength lays the foundation for power, right? And so we talked about, you mentioned briefly the force velocity curve. And really what the force velocity curve is how much output, right, you're getting. And so strength is force, like it's the measurable amount of force into a specific, generated by muscle fiber through the levers, all these different things. This is the amount of force, right? Velocity is a directional component with an acceleration component with speed, right? And with that force velocity curve, there's, we talked about training in moderate loads, right? If you pick up something that is your maximum load that you cannot pick up, it's going to take a really, really, really high force, but the actual velocity, the distance it travels, meters per second, is going to be low, right? Where if something is super, super, super light, you can have as much intent as you want, but because there's a very, very low force and you're only trying to rely on velocity, it's going to be hard to get that same high output when those are multiplied, right? So there is some, depending on the movement, where you can kind of pick and pull, where it's more the moderate force, moderate velocity, or maybe a little bit lighter force, a little bit lighter or heavier or higher velocity. But you need, it's the combining of those two components, which really get you to a high power output, that where just pure strength training, force training won't get you. And then if you're not using a load that is appropriate for the exercise with intent, that's also not going to be, suffice for that. Are we going to talk more about later about, go into the full recovery? Are we going to dive into that? Because I definitely want to talk about that.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah,
okay.
We'll talk about that because as it relates to energy systems and what's going on with the nervous system, the muscular system there. But we're talking moderate loads. So for moderate loads could be is a fairly large range going back to what you're talking about there with the force velocity curve. It's somewhere between 40 to 70% of your maximum output. So again, that's dependent on who you are, your movement, what your movement looks like, what your workout's going to look like for the day. But it's significantly less. So when we talk moderate, it's heavy enough to create a stimulus, right? But it's not so heavy that it slows us down. Once the slowness starts to happen or the mechanics start to break down, you are done. And this is something that's very tough, I think, for people to get through their head. Like they just want to go harder, like they missed the lift, right? You missed it, man. Like, why did you miss it? Is it because you're tired? Is it because your mechanics were off? Is it a combination of both or whatever? That's why going back to those core principles, the movement and the skill level that you're performing this with is extremely important. So you might need to spend some time there doing some stuff. Now, what we'll get into is kind of some of the basic things that you're probably already doing and may already have a fairly high level of skill for, that you can start to add some velocity to those movements. Things like the bench press, the deadlift. We'll talk about medicine ball throws, maybe some pulling and some pushing, upper body stuff, horizontal or vertical stuff. Those are things that you're probably already doing. You probably have access to a bar. We can keep it really simple for, sake of the conversation with like bar and bar speed. Those are things that people are generally familiar with, and you don't have to be doing Olympic lifts with that stuff in order to build power. So again, just the moderate load piece, and keeping in mind at some point there is a diminishing point of returns on the weight or the load that you are using. So better to be a little light than to be too heavy. In most cases, I don't want to make that as a blanket statement all the time, but the heavier the load, the higher level of skill is needed, right? And then we'll get into the recovery piece in a little bit here. But is there something you want to add to that?
No, we can keep going.
All right. Yeah. So again, going back to like, what are some exercises that you may be able to implement bar speed training in or velocity-based training in? And again, I just mentioned a couple of them, but one of the ones that shows up like in our FFA program right now, and we're not doing power with it yet, but we're building the foundational components of it. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. But one of the ones I opened up with in this first block of training for the folks that are on that program is a trap bar deadlift. It's a great one because of the mechanics involved. You can really load that up to build strength and practice the skill of deadlifting sans any, and it kind of eliminates those people that maybe have some mobility issues or particularly like low back issues or hinge issues where they can't fully get into a really good deadlift position, or particularly like even like a start position for like a snatch or
there's no navigating around your body because you're in the middle of the implement itself. Yeah. So
low
center
level
of gravity.
Low level of skill, a little higher center of gravity makes it easy. And the reason I put that in there is this is going to show up later. Now, we're not doing a lot of power. We're not attacking power in this first block. We're attacking the strength piece, but we will bring that one back for the power component later. So building using the lifts that you're familiar with and very good at already for this stuff is a really good place to start, that being one of them.
Yeah, that's a perfect example of, I mentioned earlier of what matters is the intent and the application of the exercise. So that's a really great example of you can do a trap bar deadlift with lots of different intentions. And you can go more of that, hey, maybe you're working in the like 85 to 90% of your 1RM or your output. And that is going to really push the strength. But then you can do a 50% and really focus on the acceleration component. And, we'll definitely, we need to talk more about like rate of force development, which is a big component of this, especially with things like deadlifts. But that's a good example of if you're wanting to increase your power, yes, there's a lot of different exercises that we love that can get very specific and very dynamic. But just the intent of how quickly you're moving the bar, right?